no way meant to be the be all end all, as we constantly need to continue growing on this. So let's get right into it. So today our goal really is to help you get an understanding of the overall importance of this topic. I like to do things in a very foundational way. So with that, we're going to talk a little bit more about what is actual diversity and inclusion. And then from there, we're going to bring out some examples that the WNBA has actually done very well on when it applies to things such as racial hiring and gender hiring, and then experience some of the change that we currently have in process. So a little bit more about me. As I mentioned when I first welcomed everybody, I'm currently an assistant professor over at Cardinal Stritch University, located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I currently teach within our sport and recreation business program. I have an opportunity to be able to talk about things such as leadership, organizational behavior, cultural backgrounds on things. We get into a lot of things, especially when we discuss ethics, the idea of diversity and inclusion. I'm also a former student athlete, had an opportunity to play baseball and football long term. I also spent about 13 years of my career working in collegiate athletics as a sports information director. I've been blessed to have the opportunity to actually work at pretty much every level of college athletics except for NCAA Division III. Had a lot of great experiences in that. I'm also a longtime coach. I've coached collegiately, and then I have an opportunity right now where I get to coach at the high school level. So getting an opportunity to talk about diversity and inclusion really has been a crucial point for me, not just as an educator, but as a coach and somebody who's inside of this industry, especially as we start to see the social scenes for younger individuals, be it the youth age, the middle school age, the prep age, as that all starts to change. And a lot of that change ends up affecting our overall professional sports because we end up seeing a little bit different groups coming into that area. So that's just a little bit about me, but let's hit the ground running here and start talking about some of this. So getting a little bit of an overview, why does any of this matter? Well, diversity and inclusion are two items that continue to grow inside of our world today. As leaders, whether we're currently in leadership positions or we're looking at getting into leadership positions, it's really important that we understand the place, not just inside of the general workforce, whether you're not even working in the world of sport, but understanding what does it actually mean inside of the world of sport, which really gives us an opportunity to explore so many dynamic personalities, dynamic individuals, dynamic cultural upbringings. So it's really important that we pay attention to this. Two authors, Doherty and Chaladouar, actually noted that sport managers must actually address the opportunities and challenges of managing an increasingly diverse workforce, particularly when it comes to the cultural diversity that can bring along with it. It's interesting if we look back to that opportunity, we look at opportunities as positives and challenges as negatives, when really this is really an opportunity for us to be able to grow. I think each of us can concede at some point we don't have all of the answers on how to best manage our organizations, how to best lead individuals. And when we kind of submit ourselves to that and look to other people's viewpoints, we get an opportunity to increase growing. So my goal in this presentation overall is to actually present diversity and inclusion by helping you to be able to define those concepts, as well as be able to help understand that a little bit more. In being able to achieve a little bit better understanding of diversity and inclusion, the goal is to highlight then how these two important concepts have actually been successfully integrated into professional sports, more particularly when we look at a professional organization such as the WNBA. Now, I will be referencing some of the other leagues along the way, but for the most part, I'm going to stay focused on the WNBA. There are a couple of reports that we'll end up diving into. Those reports, again, while I mentioned will highlight the WNBA itself, are available to you to be able to see how do the other sports, professional sports in particular, play a role in this. Honestly, the reason why I chose to focus on the WNBA is because the WNBA has really been a shining example of a league that's integrated diversity and inclusion into the workplace in really a successful manner. In 2020, the league itself actually achieved a hat trick of A-plus scores when being examined for racial hiring, gender hiring, and a combined overall grade. Now, this is actually done through a study, which we'll kind of touch on here in a little bit. But that study was done by Dr. Richard Lapchak down at the University of Central Florida. And we'll talk about his organization Tides here in a little bit as well. But this actually ended up marking the 8th time in league history that the WNBA achieved that hat trick of a perfect score, which is why I felt it was really the best opportunity for us to serve as the example going forward. That's not to say that everything is all sunshine and roses, and I'm sure individuals inside of the WNBA would probably agree to that too. But it's more about the idea of how do we continue processing, how do we continue going forward, how do we continue improving. It just so happened that the WNBA has really been doing a great job inside of racial and gender hiring practices. So before diving into what the WNBA has actually done, let's get a little bit of a foundation here as far as what are diversity and inclusion and how do they actually relate to sport. So what is actual diversity? Well, in this case, what we want to do is we want to try to get a little bit more of a foundational perspective. So in understanding diversity, diversity at its roots, according to Merriam-Webster, is the condition of having or being composed of different elements. Pretty scientific, but if we really boil this down, we can get a little bit further to say it's just differences amongst people. We all have shared things that we really enjoy being a part of. Most of us, especially if we're here inside of this conference, love the idea of being able to relate to the world of sport, be it as athletes, be it as administrators, be it as coaches, be it as those that are running on the operations side. There's that one common thread inside of it, which is really that love of sport that brings us all together. But there are differences along those ways. And some of those differences is coming from different backgrounds, coming from different upbringings, having a different story to tell. We actually, in our classroom with our students, we talk about the idea of trying to break down some of those barriers between educator and student and saying, yeah, we know that there's a little bit of a structure that's in place, a little bit of a hierarchy here that's in place. But really what we try to do is understand that each of us has our own story that has led us to where we are. And just because my story might be different from somebody else's doesn't make my story any more important than theirs, or that their story doesn't matter that much. So we take that and we would look at this to go a little bit further when it comes down to diversity and think about the inclusion of people of different races, cultures that fit inside of a group or inside of an organization. I think all too often we probably look at diversity as being more a little bit about skin color and things like that, but diversity can be so much more than that. We all have different upbringings. We come from different familial aspects. It's an opportunity for us to really be able to understand that us as individuals are unique and really have an opportunity to bring some of that unique story, that unique adventure that we've been through to possibly create something new, something innovative, or expand upon something that's been done inside of a sport organization. Inside of his book, Contemporary Leadership in Sport Organizations, David Scott actually highlighted the fact that the definition when creating a foundation as it applies to sport managers is that diversity is important to initiate inside of the sport world. Scott actually implores leaders along the way to address surface level diversity through increasing the number of diverse individuals inside of the organization. Because when we do this, it helps us to ensure that we have appropriate hiring practices, gender representation, as well as a commitment to learning as an overall concept. Because really this concept of diversity and inclusion are constantly growing. They're constantly changing along the way. So it's important for us to continue exploring that, because as we go further into diversity, it'll help us as leaders to be able to be encouraged, not just in our own growth, but also get a stronger understanding of that topic. Our goal overall within this is to get a stronger understanding to this, but we also want to figure out how do we actually improve our overall culture within inside of our organizations, and how we can learn to be able to communicate with the many different stakeholders that we have within inside of this. What this will start to do is actually allow us to create an environment of acceptance while also learning what it means to be able to model some of these ideas. When we do this, I think we end up finding ourselves a little bit more satisfied with the work that we're being able to put forward and being able to practice this. it allows us, especially from an HR perspective, to potentially retain employees better because we're trying to reach out. We're trying to find a little bit more about them. We're trying to explore with them. We're trying to learn what makes them tick and how we can utilize that to increase the efficiency and overall success within inside the organization. Scott also mentions inside of his book that understanding diversity will help us to understand the differences with inside of the actual workforce, as well as people's experiences inside of the workforce and outside of that, which can ultimately play a role in a leader's growth in being able to improve relations throughout the overall organization. A lot of times when we look at the world of sport, we talk about the concept of teamwork and being able to bring people together. But if we don't actually practice that, all we end up doing is dividing people along the way. This gives us that opportunity to be able to bring people a little bit closer if we try to figure out what makes them work, and allows us, of course, if we can improve those relations, to start to create a little bit more of that team focused. Okay. In doing this, it's going to help us as overall leaders be able to develop, as well as understand, what does diversity itself actually mean? How does this apply? How can we go a little bit further to it? But we can't just understand diversity, because if we look at the idea of diversity itself, it's kind of like you can't have one without the other. And in this instance, we can't really have diversity unless we also have inclusion. So when we look at the idea of inclusion, we have to remember that inclusion and diversity actually have an opportunity to work together. Okay. So if we look at inclusion, I would typically tell a student, hey, we don't really end up taking a word and defining that by including the root word to it. But in this case, there's really no better way to be able to show inclusion other than to say it's the act of including or the act of being included. It can also be the fact that we're willing to make accommodations for those that may have historically been excluded for a variety of different reasons. Okay. When we define inclusion, it's really significant to be able to round out that process of understanding of how it works in that symmetry within inside of diversity itself. We talked about the fact that it's that idea of including people, but also that idea of potentially accommodating those that have been excluded. And when we talk about exclusion, it's because people may have been excluded based off of their race, off of their gender, their sexuality, or even their own abilities. What we're really trying to do is understand that at the end of the day, the journey that people on all have an opportunity to help make an organization, especially a sport organization, successful. And I think once we open our eyes to that, we end up seeing something that can be pretty darn special when we give people an opportunity. But by having a straightforward definition here of inclusion as it relates to those that have actually been excluded in the past, this is where we'll start to turn a little bit of our analysis to the WNBA, because the WNBA actually features examples as it relates to people of color, as well as different genders, but in this case, more as it applies to females. The importance of these two areas are actually exemplified a little bit if we double back to Scott here, who said the strongest and most persevering leadership effort related to diversity and inclusion in sport is in that the United States actually has occurred to be able to develop more women's participation as well as employment inside of the field of sport. And we've seen a lot more examples that have come along the way, but this is what really sets our table for where we're going to move forward with looking at some of the studies and such that have actually been done. It's important overall to remember, okay, that diversity and inclusion, that one, these aren't new concepts, okay, but inside of the world of sport, we have an opportunity to explore them on an even greater level because of the idea that we have so much more media attention to things, okay? We have a great opportunity to be able to understand them a little bit more deeply than just that surface level to it. And I say that because inside of the world of sport, you get so many different people that play sport. Sport is not just stuck here inside of the United States. We know sport to be so large from a global perspective. And globally, though, if you travel, you understand that cultures have different backgrounds. Cultures think of different things that are acceptable or unacceptable. So inside of the world of sport, we become united under that umbrella of the particular sport that athletes are playing, but yet they still have the opportunity to retain some of that unique value along the way. So let's look at the WNBA overall, okay? The WNBA right now is currently setting the example. All right, they've been a strong example for diversity and inclusion, according to a lot of major studies. And there is one major study that I'm going to highlight throughout the rest of this presentation. The goal overall is to not say that, hey, this organization has figured absolutely everything out. And when people are trying to get into diversity and inclusion, that there's just one way to do it. There's a phrase that we like to use that you got to dot your T's and cross your I's. Well, if you look at the root of an I and a T, it's basically a straight line. And if you cross an intended I and dot an intended T, you still end up with T's and I's. Okay. This is important because what we try to manage, especially with inside of our student population and the individuals that we believe are going to be the leaders of tomorrow, and even something for myself as somebody who gets an opportunity to lead today, is understanding that there's more than one way to be able to do things. But if we can really find an organization or individuals that can create a solid framework that we can work within, this really gives us an opportunity to be able to work forward and to feel like we're actually making some kind of progress along the way. So this is why I had chosen to highlight the WNBA, because what the WNBA is doing right now is they're creating a framework that other organizations have started to take notice of and an opportunity to be able to build forward on. So that's why I felt they were going to be a strong example for the study that we'll end up presenting out as well. And they can serve as a beacon for organizations that are actually looking to improve their diversity and inclusion. Now, going forward, some of the information that I'm going to end up highlighting for you is an opportunity to serve as information. Okay, it's an opportunity to kind of hopefully get your creative juices going, hopefully get a little bit of that curiosity going, because once we start to get a little bit more curious about things, that's when we start to look at the opportunities we have inside of our organizations, inside of our sport teams, inside of a multitude of facets to see where can we start to build up with diversity and inclusion. So it's not just a matter of checking a box, but more so being very intentional about what we're trying to do with this. So let's look forward here. First off, the study that I'm actually going to be highlighting for you is actually done through a group called Tides, and looking at this idea of creating waves of change, okay, and being able to look forward. Tides is actually an institute for diversity and ethics in sport. It's actually led by director Dr. Richard Lapchick, who I've had an opportunity, unfortunately not an opportunity to meet in person, but I've had a lot of opportunities to read his work. It's very straightforward, very unintentional, or very intentional about the information that it's trying to communicate. But really what it's trying to do is open the eyes to a multitude of people to see some of the things that can be done differently. Just to kind of see the statistics, because as many of you know, when you work in a professional sport organization, the days tend to be a blur. And when they're a blur, we forget, when we're always trying to get to the next day, to take a step back and look at the progress that has been made. So in referencing this, I'm going to be doubling back to Tides here and some of the studies that they've done, but I want to point out here some of the studies that they have actually done through here. So what Tides actually does is serves as a comprehensive resource for issues related to gender and race in amateur, collegiate, and professional sports and media. What they do is they actually research and publish a variety of studies, including the international recognized racial and gender report card, which is something that we're going to be diving through here. So this report is typically done on an annual basis. We're actually working from some of the information from that's about 1.5 years old. But in 2021, Lapchick actually released the report through Tides. And the report actually aimed to bring a little bit of perspective to the progress that's been accomplished within sports such as the National Basketball Association, Major League Baseball, Major League Soccer, the National Football League, and then, of course, the Women's National Basketball Association, and also collegiate athletics. These reports have actually been published since about 2004, but Lapchick's study actually uses a pretty straightforward letter grade system, awarding leagues based on awarding a grade based on a grading scale that we actually have placed here inside of the presentation. It's actually a chart here where we actually see the race and gender side to it. Okay. Now, to achieve a particular letter grade, to help you understand how the scoring worked, the leagues were compared with overall society and the numbers reflected through federal affirmative action policy. Now, if that policy stated that 12% of the population consisted of people of color, well, then an A would be scored by leagues that achieved 12% of their workforce being held by people of color. The 2020 study done that I'm going to be referencing through, done by LAPIC, actually states that a new scale that they're using for race and gender, to get an A for race, the category now actually needs to be improved by about 30% people of color. And to get an A for gender, 45% is actually needed. You can actually find that on page 35 within inside of the study. But this overall study is really giving us an opportunity to serve as a foundation for the analysis regarding the WNBA, because they were the one that really kind of shone through. They were the one that really checked all the marks to things, and their ability to champion the idea of diversity and inclusion throughout the league has really been huge for it. So this is where we're going to reside from this. But this study, of course, done by Tides, is available online. All the information that I'm referencing, of course, is available online as well. But just a phenomenal study, a great opportunity. Organizations, that might be watching this presentation, if you have an opportunity, this is really something that is worth diving into, because it gives you an opportunity to kind of see a multitude of information along the way and just kind of see where you might be sitting with things. Okay. So what we'll start to do next is we're going to start to look at the WNBA from a racial hiring perspective, and then we're going to look at the WNBA from a gender hiring perspective. Okay. And the overall goal here is to look at some of the success that they've experienced, to see how they've increased their numbers along the way. And I will point out, there were some decreases in some of these numbers according to LabChick's reports. But what it does is it helps us to figure out, where do we need to be? How do we improve this? And I will state before we dive into some of this, or I'll reiterate, is it's more of an opportunity for growth. How do we continue to get better at this as our world around us is constantly changing, as society changes, as some of our definitions that we have within inside of society changes? How do organizations, how do us as leaders be able to change within that as well? But the first thing that we're going to look at is the WNBA and how they've done with racial hiring overall. So when it comes to racial hiring within inside of popular sports, WNBA has actually set the bar as of 2020. According to that study that I referenced here, done on racial hiring and gender-based hiring, the WNBA ended up receiving a combined score of A+, which is absolutely phenomenal. In determining how well the WNBA ended up performing in its racial practices, Tides ended up conducting the study to include racial-based breakdowns regarding players, management within inside organizations, as well as the WNBA league office. Now, according to the study that was done by Tides, the racial hiring from the league ended up increasing from 95.6% in 2019 to 96.7% in 2020. Now, the league's player pool, which is one of only four percentage decreases inside of the study from the previous year, still ended up achieving an A+ score, because it was composed of about 79.6% people of color inside of it. So even though there was a little bit of I don't want to say a drop, but we started to see something a little bit different happen inside of the player pool, they're still showing a lot of diversity inside of that. Now, beyond players, we can look at coaches. Coaches also ended up experiencing a strong result inside of diversity. Now, out of the 12 teams that make up the WNBA, 25% of them were actually led by head coaches of color, a number that actually stayed the same from about 2019. Assistant coaching positions actually held by people of color saw a spike from 2019 as the number increased nearly 12%. That's a pretty phenomenal growth, as they went from 2019 into 2020, going up from 42.3% to 54.2%. Now, the percentage for assistant coaches is particularly encouraging, because that percentage of people of color serving as assistants was about 50% in 2008 and dropped in 2019. It went from 50% in 2018 down to 42.3, and then ended up rebounding along the way. Now, people that might be a part of this that understand the world of coaching, we know that especially assistant coaches tend to see a lot of ebbs and flows on things, mainly because there's a lot of demands that are placed on coaches. But it was nice to see that the WNBA was able to rebound that and pull that number back up. Because when you look at that, especially from an HR perspective, you think, okay, what happened from 2018 to 2019 that we ended up experiencing that almost a little less than 8% drop, and where do we go from there? One of the biggest things to recognize, though, is that number did rebound. And I think when it comes down to things such as racial hiring and diversity, yeah, you're going to see ebbs and flows along the way. But as long as you're paying attention to it, that's where, people that are handling your data and stuff have an opportunity to be able to look qualitatively and quantitatively to say, okay, what may have caused that? Because as many of us will point out, typically if you bring in a brand new head coach, well, that new head coach likes to clear out his or her staff. And in doing so, what they like to do is they bring in a whole brand new staff of people that they've worked with, people that they trust along the way, people that they've met along the way, which can also fluctuate these numbers. What it also doesn't account for is assistant coaches that may have moved on to other opportunities. So perhaps somebody may have moved on to the NBA. Somebody may have taken collegiate jobs. But all we know is during that time, from 2018 to 2019, that drop showed that we didn't end up maintaining the number or increasing it, but we saw a decrease in a diverse workforce during that time. The nice thing, though, is from 2019 into 2020, is we did see that rebound happen from there, which has been pretty great. So 2020 also saw encouraging numbers within inside of the front office of teams and leagues. Now, for the average fan, diversity, when we think about this, really is what we end up kind of seeing out on the court, that product that we end up seeing out there. But for the average fan, beyond that, diversity on the court, of course, is not completely unexpected. There's more opportunities to actually, it sounds trite to say there's more opportunities for people to compete as athletes than there are inside of front office positions, administrative positions. But those are the more visible spots where we tend to see some of that. It's that whole iceberg theory, that idea that we really only see that 10% that's above the water, and an opportunity for us to look beneath the water and see what's coming underneath that. That's really kind of where we're focusing a little bit more in trying to understand diversity can't just happen out in the field. It's got to happen behind the scenes, even when people aren't looking for that. So the WNBA ended up showcasing a pretty strong level of diversity inside of their front office and within the league office overall. In 2020, general managers of color actually held steady at about 25% from the previous year, while those of color that held positions such as vice president or higher unfortunately dropped from 27.4% in 2019 to 26.1% in 2020. This is just the second area that the WNBA had any kind of decrease on things. So what we saw is we did see a nice little rebound about things, especially growth for assistant coaches and head coaches. But one thing I really want to highlight is this idea that growth is constantly important, especially, growth not just for assistant coaches, where assistant coaches, there's a lot of responsibilities, of course, that fall on assistant coaches and head coaches along the way, and support staff. Understanding that we have to continue that growth, that even when we see some ebbs and flows, it's a lot easier to explain when we see some of those drops in numbers, when we know why that's happening. And I gave an earlier example of, hey, an organization let go of a head coach, and that head coach, took with them their staff. The new head coach brought in a different staff. It's really difficult, in those situations, but it's an opportunity to be able to understand, well, why did we experience that drop off? And then where did we experience some of that increase as well? So with this, we can kind of turn our page a little bit more to gender hiring. Okay. Now, looking to be known as a league of inclusion, the WNBA and its teams started to serve as a model for hiring when it comes to placing women inside of various positions, led by its coaches, who, aside from players, are the most visible entity inside of the league. The WNBA actually saw a percentage of women who serve as head coach hold steady from about 41.7% in 2019 and 2020, but experience that increase in assistant coaches roles. The number of women as assistant coaches increased a full percentage point as they went from 61.5% in 2019 to 62.5% in 2020. Now, off the court, the league actually continued the trend of being an organization that is inclusive to women, as according to LabCheck and his findings, females holding positions of vice president or higher increased from about 48.6% to 50.7%. So we saw a jump of almost a little over 2.5% highlight for this. The great thing with this is that number improved at the league level in 2020, as 2019 actually saw women holding these positions at 48.9%, while increasing to an astonishing 60.9%, which was the largest spike back in 2020. These are just some of the examples of how the NBA is trying to bring diversity and inclusion throughout its operations. Now, if we look away from the court and we look at some of the business operations, the WNBA itself tries to exemplify this throughout by leading its organization within diversity and inclusion, as it actually partners with the NBA. And the two leagues launched a conscious inclusion training created to aid in the understanding and administering of unconscious bias. Now, when we think about unconscious bias, researchers who end up doing these particular studies, or any study for that matter, always introduce some form of bias. Inside of the educational world, when you're going through research, there's a steady goal of trying to maintain a level of objectivity to things, because when you start to get into subjectiveness, you've got too many editorial asides that are happening along the way. So good researchers really try to bring in objectivity through it. They try to remove themselves from the process. They try to look mainly just at the numbers. If they're looking at quantitative studies, if they're looking at qualitative studies, it's an opportunity for them just to establish themes and narratives based off of their research, but they try to leave some of their own opinion out of it. Well, truth be told, even as researchers, even if we look at coaches, players, assistant coaches, administrators, it's really difficult to remove any kind of bias on things. We've all had our own stories, our own upbringings, and in having those upbringings, we are naturally creating some biases along the way. Okay, so for instance, if you're somebody that has a bias towards people that are inside of different classes, yeah, that bias is automatically going to be out there until you get an opportunity to experience what people go through in that situation. We're just kind of naturally built with those biases in it. So by the two leagues actually coming together and launching training about this, what we're trying to do is understand that there is a way that we can understand you have biases, I have biases, and we may not intently be trying to put those onto somebody, but we have to understand that we might be doing it accidentally. We might be doing it unintentionally, but we're still doing it. And in doing so, it really helps to understand, how do we do that? How do we understand it? How do we understand where people are coming from? Which is why it's a great thing that the two leagues have actually joined together to help then understand, hey, how are we actually being unconsciously biased? How are we putting this information out there? How are we struggling with this along the way? The two leagues also joined together to create the NBA, WNBA Pride, intending to unite LGBTQ employees along with allies to help them feel supported and encouraged to actually bring 100% to work every day. I think everybody can admit when they're struggling with something inside of their personal life. They've got other things that are happening for them, other interests outside of their work side, other things that help define them when they're struggling. Especially as we've seen people that are inside of the LGBTQ arena, there's still a lot of difficulty with acceptance. And I think it's not exclusive to that. We see people having difficulties accepting things that are different than the trends and societally accepted practices that we've seen in the past. But now, as we've started to grow and change, the workforces, especially with NBA, WNBA Pride, is trying to encourage people of all backgrounds to be able to come in and feel like they can actually be inside of a comfortable work setting, to feel like they're not being oppressed upon, but that they can bring their best effort every day and be themselves, which I think ultimately at the end of the day is one of the greatest things that we can do for individuals, is to bring them on board and make them feel like they're in an organization that matters to them, that it's not just a matter of us trying to get great work out of them, but how can they feel like they want to be a part of it? Because if we really strip this all away, no matter all the technology and everything, the best form of advertising is always word of mouth. And if we have employees and stuff that don't feel like they're accepted into an organization, don't feel like they get proper training, don't feel like they get an opportunity to be themselves, those are people that are going to go out and speak differently against our brand. And ultimately, that will stop hiring managers from being able to bring people on board. And eventually it will make its way to the fans. Okay. So it's important to be able to note these things and put these out there. Now, Lapchick also noted the fact that the two leagues are also members of Diversity and Inclusion Sport Consortium, otherwise known as DISC, while also having just completed the 7th year as partners to the Women in Sports and Events, the WISE organization, which is really a neat thing to be a part of, but just an opportunity to be able to do some pretty amazing things for people. And I think what it shows is, organizations such as the WNBA are really trying to make a conscious effort towards putting themselves out there. So let's move forward here. So where do we go? Well, the WNBA overall is furthering diversity and inclusion. Lapchick mentions inside of his study that the WNBA continues to be an example for equitable racial and gender hiring practices across all professional leagues. WNBA Commissioner Kathy Engelbert also is on record as saying, that the league is built on the foundation of courage, cognizance of bias, curiosity, cultural intelligence, collaboration, and commitment. Each one of those in and of itself is a difficult thing to achieve because there's so much that goes into it. But imagine being inside of your organization and trying to really make a conscious effort for this. The WNBA has really demonstrated itself to be an organization that not only encourages diversity and inclusion, but one that's trying to champion it on as many levels as possible. Now, the assumption that we can make from this is that every organizational leader would probably agree that these two areas can constantly be improved, but it really falls on leaders to be able to identify that, yeah, these are things that are out there. They're things that are important to our societal makeup. They're things that are important to our players. They're things that are important inside of our organizations. How do we try to address them a little bit better? How can we continue to grow? We do have to remember, though, that when it comes down to diversity and inclusion, kind of that concept that Rome wasn't built in a day, okay? There's going to be situations where trying to build in new policies, we're going to have to take into general decision-making skills and understanding that when we look at the opportunity to implement diversity and inclusion, it's this idea of how do we take this opportunity? What are some alternatives that we have that can go inside of organizations that will allow us to actually put some of these key processes in place to increase diversity and inclusion inside of our organization? How do we do this? How do we implement it? But understanding you might not implement everything perfectly, but as long as you give yourself opportunities and you don't implement something perfectly, you'll have an opportunity to double back and say, all right, this opportunity, this alternative didn't work for us. What's another alternative that can work for us? Diversity and inclusion, I think we all can agree, continues to be something that's important inside of our organizations as businesses. It's extremely important inside of the world of sport. And it's something really that we have to continue improving upon. It's not going away. It's just not going to fall off the board. And that's not a bad thing. What it is it's an opportunity for sport organizations to be able to be those boundary pushers, those organizations that will innovate. We all know and can agree at the end of the day that sport is a business and needs to find a way to be able to bring more people in. But why not do it while also being socially responsible to those that are actually purchasing tickets and being around at things? Ultimately, diversity and inclusion are more than just buzzwords. Through some of the examples that I posed here with the WNBA, which I believe honestly is a really great example of being able to bring different people on board and try to get new ideas inside. What we have to remember is that the examples that are actually set by some of our most popular sport leagues end up impacting our future. So I thought no better thing than to put a picture of children that are up there. I look at the opportunity with my 3 children and think about all the things that they get to experience inside of youth sports. And I think about this concept that if we start to see it from those that are leading right now, be it our professional athletes, be it our professional organizations, the administrators, everybody that's kind of leading this along the way, it's not that we have to have a perfect solution, but we have to at least be trying. And I think that's where we have an opportunity for that. So with that, I would like to say thank you for the opportunity to present this information to you. I appreciate you listening. If you do have any questions of me at all regarding some of the information that I put out there today, please feel free to reach out to me. You can reach me at dwsnieg@stritch.edu. If there's anything further that I can help provide to you, organizations, or you've just got some curiosity on things, and you're like, hey, we maybe want to try some things. The opportunity to start the conversation, of course, is something that I find very intriguing, very important. But most of all, I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank the National Sport Forum for allowing me to put this out front as well as my family for supporting me in this. But ultimately, thank you to all of you for being here. And I look forward to hopefully interacting with you all soon. Have a great day.